Memphis, 2018. The city's Truth and Light Church was abuzz with quiet speculation as it prepared for what many called the most unexpected wedding of the year. Pastor Henry Jackson, a respected leader with an unblemished reputation, was set to marry Layla Thompson, a young woman half his age. Henry had served the community for decades, known for his unwavering faith, calm demeanor, and the profound influence he held over his congregation. However, this union raised questions that no one dared to voice openly. Layla, a 25-year-old woman with a delicate frame and a withdrawn nature, stood at the altar with an expression that bordered on vacant. Her posture was tense, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the bouquet, her gaze darting nervously across the sea of familiar faces. Unlike most brides, she did not beam with joy or excitement. Instead, there was a quiet resignation in her eyes, as if she were fulfilling an obligation rather than stepping into a new chapter of happiness. The hushed whispers among the guests reflected the unease they felt but were too afraid to express aloud. The ceremony itself was modest yet dignified, with muted floral arrangements and a subdued atmosphere. Henry, dressed impeccably in his dark suit, stood tall with the confidence of a man who had everything under control. He greeted guests warmly, his charisma on full display, but his bride's demeanor cast an unsettling contrast. Some of the older women in the congregation exchanged glances, silently questioning why Layla, who had always been so quiet and reserved, had agreed to this marriage. Others reassured themselves that the pastor's wisdom and leadership could not be doubted. Murmurs of concern circulated after the ceremony. Some speculated that Henry had taken Layla under his wing out of compassion, while others whispered of a deeper, more troubling reason behind their union. The more observant members of the church began noticing Layla's increasingly rare appearances at services after the wedding. When she did attend, she seemed distant, her eyes fixed on the floor, her presence more like an obligation than a willing participation. Among those who found the situation suspicious was Mark Williams, a former military man who had returned to Memphis seeking solace in faith. His sharp instincts and disciplined mind quickly picked up on the inconsistencies surrounding the pastor's new marriage. Unlike the others, he was not easily swayed by Henry's charm. Something about Layla's demeanor unsettled him, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the way she seemed to recoil at the sound of Henry's voice. It did not take long for him to notice that she never lingered after services and was always escorted by Henry with a firm grip on her arm. Mark's suspicions deepened when he began observing Henry's interactions with Layla outside of the church. He noticed that she rarely left their home, a grand but isolated house on the outskirts of town. The lights in the house remained dim throughout the evenings, and no visitors ever seemed to come by. On the rare occasions when Layla did step out, it was always under Henry's watchful eye, and she seemed constantly on edge. Mark started asking questions within the congregation, carefully probing for any details that might confirm his growing concerns. Conversations with fellow churchgoers revealed troubling details. Some mentioned that Layla had been living with Henry even before their marriage, and others hinted that she had no close friends or family in Memphis. Several women recalled that she avoided eye contact and spoke in hushed tones, if at all. Her reluctance to engage in social gatherings or women's Bible studies only added to the air of mystery surrounding her. Mark's mind began piecing together a theory, one that painted a sinister picture of coercion and control. He speculated that Henry had used his position of authority to force Layla into marriage, possibly through blackmail or psychological manipulation. The idea of a trusted spiritual leader abusing his influence disgusted him, and he became determined to uncover the truth. Late one evening, Mark parked his car near the pastor's house and watched from a distance. Through the dimly lit windows, he observed Henry pacing the living room while Layla sat motionless on the couch, her shoulders hunched and her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The dynamic between them was not one of mutual affection but of dominance and submission. Mark felt a surge of determination. He knew he could not stand by and do nothing. The thought of confronting Henry directly was tempting, but Mark knew the man's influence stretched far beyond the church walls. He needed solid proof before making any accusations. He resolved to watch, to gather evidence, and to find a way to help Layla escape what he believed was an oppressive situation. Little did he know that the truth was far more complicated than he could have imagined, and his interference would set in motion a series of events that no one could have foreseen. Layla lived in Pastor Henry Jackson's large house on the outskirts of Memphis, a grand yet oddly secluded property surrounded by a tall, wrought iron fence. From the outside, the house appeared to be a peaceful sanctuary, immaculate landscaping, pristine white shutters, and a welcoming front porch that suggested warmth and security. However, inside those walls, an atmosphere of silent tension lingered, suffocating and oppressive. The house, though well-maintained, felt more like a carefully curated stage than a home. Everything was in perfect order, yet the air was thick with an uneasy stillness that seemed to cling to the very walls. Layla spent most of her days in solitude, confined within the spacious yet eerily empty rooms. She rarely ventured outside, only glimpsing the world beyond through the lace curtains that framed the windows. The few times she did step onto the porch, it was always under Henry's watchful eye, his presence looming like an invisible chain that kept her tethered to the house. Her absence from church events and social gatherings did not go unnoticed, and soon whispers began to circulate among the congregation. Speculation grew with each passing day. Some believed she was a recluse by choice, while others suspected that Henry had imprisoned her under the guise of protection. Henry's behavior, at first glance, appeared nurturing. He provided for Layla's every need, bringing home groceries, ensuring the house remained stocked with everything necessary, and personally overseeing her well-being. He would often return from the pharmacy with small brown paper bags, their contents a mystery to onlookers. While some saw his devotion as an act of love, others found his vigilance unsettling. His insistence on keeping the house secured at all times, with every door and window locked, only fueled the rumors. Even deliveries were left at the gate, with no visitors allowed inside. Mark Williams, growing increasingly suspicious, began to observe the house more closely. From his vantage point across the street, he watched as Henry arrived home at precise hours each day, carrying bags filled with supplies and medicine. He noticed the way Layla occasionally peeked through the curtains, her eyes darting around nervously before disappearing back into the shadows. Her face, pale and drawn, bore an expression of quiet desperation that Mark could not ignore. Every time she appeared at the window, it was brief, almost as if she feared being caught looking outside. Driven by concern, Mark sought out the neighbors, hoping to uncover more about Layla's life before she became Pastor Henry's wife. Through quiet conversations and cautious inquiries, he pieced together fragments of her story. She had arrived in Memphis 2 years ago under unclear circumstances, with no family or friends to speak of. Some neighbors recalled seeing her at the local shelter, struggling to rebuild her life after fleeing what they assumed was a troubled past. Henry had taken her in, offering shelter and support, and in time, their relationship had evolved into marriage. It was said that she had come from hardship, poverty, loss, and personal struggles that no one fully understood. Despite this newfound information, Mark remained unconvinced. If Henry had truly rescued her from a difficult life, why did she seem so isolated? Why did she avoid eye contact with others, and why did she flinch whenever Henry spoke to her in public? The pieces did not fit together, and the more he observed, the more certain he became that Layla was being held against her will. To him, the house was not a sanctuary but a cage, and Henry was not her savior but her captor. Layla's world inside the house was defined by routine and silence. Each morning, she woke to the sound of Henry moving through the halls, his presence a constant reminder of her circumstances. The large house, with its high ceilings and ornate furnishings, felt more like a prison with invisible bars. She moved through the rooms like a ghost, careful not to disturb the carefully arranged perfection. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway became a steady companion, marking the passage of long, uneventful days. She found solace in small things, the books Henry allowed her to read, the soft hum of the radio that filled the empty space, and the occasional glance through the window at the outside world. Yet, the weight of her isolation pressed down on her, and she often found herself staring at the locked front door, imagining what lay beyond it. The fear that once kept her compliant now wrestled with an emerging desire for freedom, and each day, the conflict within her grew stronger. Mark, sensing the urgency of the situation, decided it was time to take action. He could no longer stand by and watch as Layla remained trapped in what he believed to be an oppressive environment. He resolved to find a way to speak to her, to offer her a way out, and to ensure that whatever hold Henry had over her would be broken. The thought of confronting the pastor directly was risky, but Mark's conscience would not allow him to ignore what he perceived as a desperate cry for help. What he did not realize, however, was that the truth behind Layla's isolation was far more complex than he could have imagined, and his interference would set into motion a chain of events that would change everything. One evening, Mark waited outside Henry's house, his heart pounding with anticipation. The shadows stretched long across the quiet street, and the distant hum of traffic from the city barely reached the outskirts where the house stood in eerie stillness. Mark had been watching the house for weeks, learning Henry's schedule and waiting for the perfect opportunity. That night, he saw his chance when Henry drove away, leaving Layla alone inside. Taking a deep breath, he crossed the street and approached the house, his footsteps cautious against the gravel pathway. Layla appeared in the window, her face partially obscured by the curtain. At first, she hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, and for a moment, it seemed as though she might retreat back into the house without a word. Mark's presence clearly unsettled her, and she fidgeted with the edge of the curtain, torn between her fear and an unspoken longing for help. He gestured for her to come outside, his expression reassuring yet urgent. After several tense moments, she finally stepped out onto the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched the railing. Her voice was barely above a whisper, hesitant and filled with uncertainty. She refused to meet his gaze at first, her posture defensive and wary. Mark, speaking calmly and gently, urged her to trust him. Slowly, Layla began to open up, her voice shaking as she revealed the fear that had consumed her life. She confided in him that Henry controlled every aspect of her existence, that she was not allowed to leave without his permission, and that he had made it clear she would never escape him. The weight of her words settled heavily on Mark, solidifying his belief that she was a prisoner in her own home. Encouraged by Mark's persistence, Layla reluctantly agreed to try and escape. They devised a plan, cautious and methodical. That night, she would leave the window in her bedroom unlocked, allowing Mark to slip inside without drawing attention. He would take her away from the house, from the city, far enough that Henry could never find her again. Mark promised her safety, his determination unwavering. Layla's hands shook as she nodded, the hope in her eyes battling against years of conditioned fear. The plan seemed simple, but unease gnawed at Mark. Something about the house, about Henry's meticulous control, made him feel as though the pastor would not let her go so easily. Despite his reservations, he assured Layla that everything would be fine. He left her standing on the porch, her eyes watching him disappear into the night, and he could only hope that she would find the strength to follow through. When the agreed-upon time arrived, Mark returned to the house, his heart racing with anticipation. The street was dark, the only sound being the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the wind. He crept around to the side of the house and found the window as they had planned, slightly ajar, a small beacon of trust. Climbing through carefully, he landed in the dimly lit room, his eyes scanning for any sign of Layla. To his surprise, the house was silent, almost too still. Moving cautiously, he made his way down the hall, where he found Layla standing in the middle of the living room. Tears streamed down her face, her hands trembling violently. Her expression was one of heartbreak and fear, and before Mark could speak, he sensed the looming presence behind him. Henry stood in the doorway, his face a mask of quiet fury and bitter disappointment. His usually composed demeanor was gone, replaced with an intensity that sent a chill down Mark's spine. The weight of the moment hung heavy between them. Henry's eyes darted between Layla and Mark, filled with unspoken accusations and restrained anger. The tension shattered as Henry took a step forward, his voice low but charged with emotion. Mark instinctively moved in front of Layla, his protective instincts kicking in. The pastor's movements were slow but deliberate, his fists clenched at his sides. Mark, feeling cornered, pushed Henry back, but the older man was stronger than he appeared. A struggle broke out, their bodies colliding in the dimly lit room, the furniture rattling around them. Layla's cries echoed through the house as Mark fought to restrain Henry. The two men grappled, each determined to gain the upper hand. Henry's grip was fierce, his movements controlled and calculated, but Mark's desperation made him reckless. The struggle reached its peak when Mark shoved Henry with all his strength, sending him stumbling backward. A sickening crack echoed through the room as Henry's head struck the edge of the fireplace mantel. He collapsed to the ground, motionless, the breath rushing out of him in a final gasp. Layla's sobs filled the heavy silence that followed. Mark stood frozen, his chest heaving, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The weight of his actions settled in like an unbearable burden. Henry, the man he had believed to be a captor, now lay lifeless at his feet. The night, once filled with the promise of escape, had taken a dark and irreversible turn. The struggle between Mark and Henry erupted with a sudden and violent force, shattering the fragile silence that had previously lingered in the house. Henry moved with surprising agility for a man his age, his years of discipline and control evident in the way he defended himself. His hands, usually raised in blessing and guidance, were now clenched into tight fists as he tried to fend off Mark's relentless attacks. Mark, driven by a potent mix of fear and righteous anger, lashed out with unwavering conviction, each strike fueled by the belief that he was rescuing Layla from a life of imprisonment. The room became a battlefield, the furniture shifting and toppling around them as they grappled. Picture frames crashed to the floor, their glass shattering under the weight of their struggle. The dim lighting flickered, casting long shadows that danced across the walls, accentuating the chaos unfolding within. Layla stood frozen in the doorway, her wide eyes reflecting terror as she watched the two men locked in combat. She screamed, her voice high and desperate, pleading for them to stop, but her cries went unheard, drowned out by the grunts and heavy breathing of the fight. Henry fought with the determination of a man protecting something far more valuable than himself, his movements defensive rather than aggressive. He blocked Mark's wild swings with surprising strength, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sorrow. He tried to speak, his lips forming silent words that never made it past the deafening sound of fists meeting flesh. Mark, however, saw none of it. His vision was clouded with rage, his mind set on one goal, to end this once and for all. Every movement was calculated, every blow aimed at forcing Henry into submission. With each passing second, the balance of power shifted. Henry's defenses began to falter under Mark's relentless assault. His breathing grew labored, his movements slower, but he refused to back down. Mark pressed forward, his adrenaline surging, his thoughts racing with the singular idea that this was the only way to free Layla. He could feel his own strength overpowering Henry's resistance, and it only spurred him on further. In a final act of desperation, Henry attempted to regain control, lunging forward with a last burst of energy. Mark, caught off guard by the sudden movement, reacted instinctively, pushing Henry back with all his might. The momentum sent Henry stumbling backward, his feet skidding against the hardwood floor. His arms flailed briefly in a futile attempt to regain balance before his body collided with the edge of the stone fireplace mantel. A sickening crack echoed through the room as the back of his head struck the unforgiving surface. For a moment, everything stood still. Henry's body crumpled to the floor in a heap, his limbs splayed awkwardly, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The tension that had gripped the room moments before was replaced by an eerie stillness. Mark stared down at him, his fists still clenched, his chest heaving with exertion. His mind struggled to catch up with the reality of what had just occurred. The anger that had driven him so fiercely was now replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Layla let out a strangled sob, her hands covering her mouth as she stepped hesitantly closer to Henry's unmoving form. Her entire body trembled, her eyes darting between Mark and the man on the floor. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words that escaped were a jumbled mess of panic and confusion. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt beside Henry, her hands hovering over him without touching, as if afraid of what she might find. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears like a drum of impending doom. He took a step back, his legs suddenly weak, his mind racing through the consequences of what had just transpired. The weight of his actions pressed down on him like a leaden burden, and for the first time, doubt crept into his thoughts. Had he done the right thing? Had he acted too rashly? The certainty that had fueled his rage only moments ago now seemed foolish and naive. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Mark forced himself to move. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. His fingers fumbled over the screen as he dialed emergency services, his voice hoarse and trembling as he struggled to form coherent sentences. He barely registered Layla's cries in the background, her voice fractured with hysteria. The dispatcher's calm voice on the other end of the line felt distant and unreal, as if this were happening to someone else. As the call ended, Mark dropped to his knees beside Layla, his eyes fixed on Henry's still form. The room, once filled with the sounds of their struggle, now felt unbearably quiet. The seconds stretched into eternity as they waited, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator in the background and the ragged breathing of the two people left in the aftermath of what had happened. Outside, the distant wail of approaching sirens broke the silence, growing louder with each passing moment. Reality began to sink in, and Mark understood that nothing would ever be the same again. When the police arrived, the flashing red and blue lights cast long, flickering shadows across the quiet street. Officers moved swiftly, securing the scene while paramedics rushed to examine Henry's motionless body. Mark, his hands still trembling, surrendered without resistance. His face was pale, his breathing ragged, and his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and confusion. As the officers questioned him, he admitted to what had happened without hesitation, insisting that he was only trying to help Layla escape from captivity. He painted a picture of coercion, control, and a desperate struggle to save an innocent woman from a man he believed to be a monster. Detective Raymond Carter arrived shortly after, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. A seasoned investigator with years of experience in homicide and domestic disputes, he had encountered countless situations that were never as simple as they first appeared. He listened carefully to Mark's frantic explanation, his eyes narrowing with quiet skepticism. Something about the situation didn't sit right with him. The house, though filled with tension, lacked the usual signs of abuse or imprisonment. There were no chains, no hidden rooms, only an unsettling sense of something being profoundly misunderstood. As Carter moved through the house, he noticed the meticulous order in which everything was arranged. In the living room, framed photographs of Layla and Henry together adorned the shelves, depicting moments of what appeared to be genuine care rather than fear. The kitchen was stocked with healthy food, labeled meticulously, and various medications were neatly lined up on the counter. Something about the picture Mark had painted did not align with the reality Carter was seeing. When Layla was finally able to speak, her words came in fragmented whispers. She sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the officers. Her wide, tear-filled eyes darted nervously around the room as she struggled to articulate what had happened. She spoke of her fears, of wanting to leave, and of feeling trapped, but as Carter pressed gently for details, inconsistencies began to surface. She would pause mid-sentence, her gaze distant as if trapped in memories that only she could see. Her emotions seemed genuine, but there was an underlying confusion that Carter couldn't ignore. A search of the house yielded unexpected discoveries. In a locked drawer in Henry's study, officers found stacks of medical records and psychiatric evaluations dating back years. The documents detailed a long history of mental health struggles that Layla had faced, diagnoses of severe anxiety, delusional paranoia, and dissociative episodes. Prescription bottles were carefully labeled with Henry's name listed as her caregiver, and there were regular appointments scheduled with specialists in the area. The records painted a vastly different picture than the one Mark had imagined. Carter sifted through the papers, his suspicion growing. Henry hadn't been holding Layla against her will, he had been protecting her from the outside world and, more importantly, from herself. The notes from therapists and doctors indicated that Layla struggled with reality, often constructing elaborate fantasies where she felt persecuted or trapped. Her desire to escape, it seemed, was less about Henry's control and more about the impulses that plagued her mind. Mark sat in stunned silence as Carter presented the findings. The weight of his mistake settled in like a crushing force, suffocating and inescapable. He had seen only what he wanted to see, Layla's fear, her isolation, the locked doors, and had jumped to conclusions without understanding the full story. In his attempt to be a hero, he had destroyed the life of a man who had been doing his best to care for someone in need. The realization hit him with devastating clarity. He had allowed his biases, his past experiences, and his desire to fix things to cloud his judgment. Layla, unaware of the full gravity of what had transpired, sat quietly, her hands gripping the blanket tightly. She looked lost, adrift in a reality that no longer made sense to her. Carter watched her closely, recognizing the fragile state of her mind. Henry's efforts to protect her, to keep her safe from her own thoughts and the world's misunderstandings, had been mistaken for something sinister. Now, with him gone, she was left vulnerable and alone. The officers processed the scene, cataloging the evidence, and preparing to transport Mark to the station for further questioning. He didn't resist, his mind was too consumed with guilt to protest. He had been so certain of his righteousness, so convinced that he was doing the right thing, but now he saw the tragic consequences of his actions. A good man was dead, and a vulnerable woman was left without the one person who had truly understood her. As the house fell into a heavy silence, Carter stood in the center of it all, reflecting on how quickly perception could twist reality. The tragedy of it all was not just in the loss of life, but in the irreversible damage caused by assumptions and misunderstanding. Mark had wanted to save Layla, but in the end, he had only managed to take away the one person who had truly been trying to help her. With Henry gone, the future seemed uncertain for Layla. Without his guidance and structure, there was no telling how she would cope with the weight of her condition. Mark could only watch helplessly as paramedics led her out of the house, her vacant stare fixed on a point far beyond his reach. Carter knew that this case would haunt them all for a long time, a painful reminder that not everything is as it seems and that good intentions can sometimes lead to devastating consequences. The courtroom was filled with an uneasy silence as Mark sat at the defendant's table, his expression blank but his hands trembling slightly. The weight of his actions bore down on him, heavier with each passing day. As the trial unfolded, the public's perception of him remained divided. Some saw him as a misguided hero, a man who had acted with the best intentions, but tragically misunderstood the situation. Others viewed him as a reckless vigilante who had destroyed a man's life without seeking the full truth. The tension in the room was palpable, with both sides watching intently as evidence was presented. The prosecution laid out the facts methodically, emphasizing that Henry Jackson had not been an abuser, but a protector. Medical records and testimonies from mental health professionals painted a picture of Layla's fragile state and the delicate care Henry had provided to keep her safe from harm, both from the outside world and from herself. The jury listened in solemn silence as doctors described Layla's condition, her struggles with delusions and paranoia, and the careful measures Henry had taken to ensure she remained stable. The image of a controlling captor that Mark had constructed in his mind crumbled piece by piece. Mark sat motionless as the testimonies continued, absorbing every painful detail. The defense argued that Mark's actions, while tragic, stemmed from genuine concern and an honest belief that he was acting in Layla's best interest. They described his military service, his dedication to helping others, and his deep remorse for what had transpired. Despite their efforts to paint him as a man who had simply made a grave mistake, the reality of Henry's unnecessary death loomed over everything. Layla, now in a specialized mental health facility, was unable to testify in person. Her fragile state prevented her from facing the court, but her written statements were read aloud. In her words, she expressed confusion, sorrow, and a lingering sense of loss. She spoke of her appreciation for Henry's care and how his absence left her feeling adrift, struggling to distinguish reality from illusion. Her words cut through the courtroom like a blade, further solidifying the tragedy of what had happened. When the time came for Mark to address the court, he stood slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. He did not attempt to justify his actions, but instead acknowledged the irreversible damage he had caused. He spoke of his regrets, how he had allowed his assumptions to cloud his judgment, how he had ignored the subtle warnings that something about the situation was more complex than it seemed. He accepted full responsibility, his voice faltering only when he mentioned Henry's name. He knew that no amount of remorse could undo what he had done, but he hoped that by accepting his punishment, he could, in some way, honor the life he had taken. In the end, the court sentenced Mark to several years in prison for involuntary manslaughter. The judge acknowledged his good intentions, but stressed that his actions had resulted in irreversible consequences. The sentence, though not the harshest possible, felt like a life sentence in Mark's heart. He would carry the weight of his choices far beyond the prison walls. As Mark was led out of the courtroom, he caught sight of several members of Henry's congregation in the gallery. Their faces were a mixture of grief and silent condemnation. The church, once a place of refuge and community, had dissolved in the aftermath of Henry's death. Without its leader, it became a symbol of broken trust and tragic misunderstanding. The doors of the church were eventually closed, the building left empty, a reminder of how quickly faith could be overshadowed by doubt and speculation. Layla remained in treatment, receiving the care she had long needed but never fully embraced. In the facility, she was surrounded by professionals who understood her condition, offering her stability and structure. Her days were filled with therapy sessions, medication adjustments, and quiet moments of introspection. She often spoke of Henry, sometimes with clarity, sometimes with confusion, as if parts of him still existed in her fragmented mind. The past haunted her, but with time, healing began. For the people of Memphis, the story of Pastor Henry Jackson became a cautionary tale. It served as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving and that the pursuit of justice, when driven by assumption rather than understanding, could lead to devastating outcomes. The once proud legacy of Henry became a lesson in patience, compassion, and the importance of seeking the full truth before taking action. In his prison cell, Mark struggled to find peace. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, wondering how things could have been different if he had asked the right questions, if he had looked deeper instead of acting on impulse. Despite his confinement, his thoughts were his true prison, trapped in the endless cycle of regret and self-reflection. Over time, letters arrived from some members of the congregation who believed in his good intentions, offering words of forgiveness and understanding. Others sent letters filled with anger and resentment, reminders of the life he had taken and the community he had shattered. Mark read them all, accepting each one as part of his journey toward redemption. As the years passed, the memory of what had happened remained, not just in the town, but in the hearts of those who had been affected. It was a story that would never fully fade, a testament to how easily lives could be altered by a single moment of misunderstanding. And for Mark, it was a reminder that the pursuit of justice required more than good intentions. It required patience, wisdom, and, most importantly, the courage to seek the truth beyond the surface.